Okay, so it looks like we're diving into how U.S. elections impact global military alliances for this meeting.
Interesting stuff.
Definitely. I've got some excerpts here from an article called U.S. Elections and Global Military Alliances. What's at stake? Let's break it down.
Sounds good.
All right, so first off, why should anyone even care about this?
Well, because these elections, they can totally reshape the global landscape.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Especially for people involved in, well, international relations or businesses that work overseas.
Absolutely. Or anyone who just wants to understand what's going on in the world,
Hmm.
stay informed.
Right, exactly. So let's start with NATO. This article calls it like the cornerstone of transatlantic security.
Yeah, the whole idea is collective defense, right?
Hmm.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. And the U.S. obviously plays a huge role in upholding that commitment. But these excerpts highlight how, Trump's skepticism towards NATO, it really shook things up.
Oh, yeah. Totally created a ton of uncertainty among those European allies.
They were worried about the U.S. pulling back, weren't they?
Big time. Especially about support if something were to actually happen.
Then you have Biden coming in and, well, like reaffirming that commitment.
Huge difference in approach,
Eh,
for sure. It just goes to show how important consistent U.S. leadership is for NATO. I mean, when that leadership is questioned, it emboldens adversaries.
Russia.
Exactly.
So a weaker NATO would make Europe more vulnerable.
Oh, for sure. A strong NATO, it helps keep things stable in Europe, and if the U.S. disengages, it could completely disrupt that balance of power. And this is especially important now with what's going on in Ukraine, right?
Absolutely. This article mentions that some European nations actually increased their defense spending after Trump criticized NATO.
Yeah, I remember that. Kind of ironic, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, his words had a real impact, even if it wasn't the outcome he wanted.
Yeah, it really shows how sensitive the global security landscape is to U.S. rhetoric. Even the suggestion of a change in policy can set off a chain reaction.
Okay, let's move on to the U.S.-Japan alliance. This one's critical in Asia, especially with all the tension around North Korea and China.
Right, right.
The article calls it a pillar of Asian security because the U.S. guarantees Japan's protection.
The big deal.
But every U.S. election brings a new wave of uncertainty. What happens to Japan's security if, let's say, a future president scales back U.S. military presence there?
Well, Japan relies heavily on the U.S. for its defense. They've got that security umbrella,
Right.
that guarantee of protection from the U.S. If that changes, Japan might be forced to, well, reconsider its pacifist stance, which is like a core part of their constitution.
So you're saying they might feel like they have to build up their own military, maybe even develop offensive weapons?
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be a huge shift for a country with such a strong pacifist tradition.
A heavily armed Japan would definitely make some other countries nervous, right?
Oh, absolutely, especially China. It could trigger an arms race and escalate tensions even further, and the article even mentions that Japan is already taking steps toward developing offensive capabilities. Clearly, they're thinking about it.
It's like a domino effect. Uncertainty in one place leads to changes in another.
Yeah, it highlights how interconnected everything is in global security.
Yeah.
What happens in the U.S. has ripple effects all over the world.
All right, let's talk about the Middle East now. It's such a complicated web of alliances, and the U.S. is right in the middle of it, especially with countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Totally. This article brings up the Iran nuclear deal as a perfect example of how U.S. elections can rock the boat in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, that's a prime example.
You had Obama and Biden supporting the deal, then Trump pulls the U.S. out. What kind of message does that inconsistency send to U.S. allies?
Well, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it? It creates uncertainty, it makes things unpredictable, and that can really destabilize the region.
Thanks.
Countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, they depend on clear and consistent U.S. support for their security. When that support is in question, they have to rethink their positions.
They might even start looking for other alliances.
Exactly.
So even strong, long-standing partnerships are vulnerable when the U.S. political landscape shifts.
That's right. Think about Saudi Arabia. They've been close to the U.S. for decades. But recently, they've been reaching out to Iran.
Wow, so they're hedging their bets.
It seems that way. They're not sure what the future holds for the U.S. role in the region, and they're preparing for different possibilities.
We've covered a lot already, and I'm starting to see why this topic is so crucial for your meeting. But let's zoom out a bit. Say our listener isn't a diplomat or a security expert. Why should they care about this?
It goes way beyond politics, right?
Yeah.
These elections, they affect trade, economic stability. They influence the potential for conflict in different parts of the world. It's not just about what happens in Washington. It has consequences everywhere.
So basically, anyone who's involved in international business, they need to understand this.
For sure, it can help them anticipate risks and opportunities in the global market.
But even for those who aren't directly involved in international affairs, it's still important, right?
Absolutely. These decisions shape the world we live in. Everything from the products we buy to how stable different regions are.
So it's about being an informed citizen.
Exactly. Understanding the forces that shape the world around us. I mean, think about how your own work or interests could be impacted. Are you in a field that's sensitive to political instability? Do you have family or friends living abroad?
Right. These aren't just abstract ideas. They have real-world impacts.
Big time. They can affect people's lives in huge ways.
So the stakes are high.
Very high. It's important to have these conversations, to really scrutinize these policy choices, and to realize the impact they have on people all over the world.
That's a good point. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at how U.S. elections impact NATO, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and all the complexities of the Middle East.
It's a lot to unpack.
We also talked about why these elections matter to everyone, no matter what their background is or what they do for a living. But before we wrap up this part, I want to leave you with something to think about. The article mainly focuses on how other countries react to U.S. policy. But I'm wondering, what about the flip side? How do these alliances actually shape U.S. domestic politics? Is it a two-way street?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something worth exploring further. Maybe we can dive into that in part 2.
Absolutely. Join us for part 2, where we'll continue unpacking this whole relationship between U.S. elections and global military alliances.
Looking forward to it. Back again. Ready to unpack more of this.
Definitely. You know, as we finished up part 1, I kept thinking about how these alliances we've been talking about, they might actually be shaping U.S. domestic politics, too.
Oh, for sure.
It's easy to get caught up in how the U.S. influences the rest of the world. But what about the influence the world has on the U.S.?
It's a really important point. You've got this whole interplay between foreign and domestic policy, right?
Right.
And the U.S., they maintain these alliances partly out of self-interest, right?
For their own security. Yeah.
Exactly, and for their economic interests. But then those interests, they get all tangled up with domestic priorities.
So it's not all just about promoting democracy and helping other countries.
Well, that's part of it, sure. But there's a lot of give and take. Look at the U.S. military presence in Japan, for example.
Okay.
Helps deter threats in the Asia-Pacific region, right? And that directly benefits American businesses operating there.
So there's an economic incentive.
Exactly. And that economic activity then feeds back into the U.S. economy, creating jobs and supporting industries. It's a whole cycle.
Makes sense. But what about public opinion? Does that play a role in how these alliances shape things back home in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. Politicians, they're always paying attention to how the public feels, especially when it comes to national security.
Yeah, of course.
If people believe an alliance is crucial to U.S. interests, it becomes a really risky move for any leader to try and challenge it.
So, like with NATO, even a president who's skeptical of it might not want to withdraw support if the public is strongly in favor.
Exactly. They'd have to weigh the political cost. And sometimes the need to maintain these alliances, it can actually limit a president's options, even if they don't personally agree with the policy.
It's like checks and balances, but on a global level.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's all interconnected. You know, you can't just look at one side of the equation.
It's like we're uncovering all these hidden layers of complexity.
Exactly. And we're just scratching the surface here, really. You've got historical ties, cultural exchanges, ideological alignments. It's all a part of it.
So how can we make sense of all of this? How can our listener who's prepping for this meeting take all of this and make it useful?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that U.S. elections and these global military alliances, they're totally intertwined. They impact each other in all these ways we don't always see.
It's more than just who wins an election.
Right. You have to understand the context, the history, the power dynamics involved. And one of the most important things to remember is that these relationships, they're constantly evolving. What seems settled today could be a huge issue tomorrow.
Always expect the unexpected.
Exactly. The global landscape is always shifting, and those shifts can happen really fast. That's why it's so important to stay informed, understand the dynamics, and be ready to adapt.
So flexibility is key.
Huge. The ability to anticipate challenges, change strategies, and build consensus among all these different players, those are the skills that can be really valuable in a world that's so complex and unpredictable.
This is all really helpful. But before we move on to part three, I want to bring up one more thing the article mentions. We've talked about how changes in U.S. policy can make regions like East Asia or the Middle East less secure. But what does that actually mean for the people living in those places?
That's the crucial question, right? It could mean more military spending,
Okay.
and that often comes at the expense of things like social programs and economic development. It could also mean heightened tensions, an increased risk of conflict,
Which could lead to.
displacement, suffering, loss of life, all the things we see happening in conflict zones around the world.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah, it is. It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract policy debates. They have real consequences for real people.
So how do we balance these different priorities, the need for security, with the human cost of these decisions?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with empathy, with recognizing the human element in all of this and trying to make decisions that minimize harm.
It's a heavy responsibility.
It is, but it's one we all share, in a way. By being informed, by engaging in these discussions, by holding our leaders accountable, we can try to make sure those decisions are made with as much care and consideration as possible.
That's a good point. Well, on that note, I think we're ready for part three, where we can delve deeper into the long-term implications of these choices.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so we've explored a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
All these intricate relationships between U.S. elections and global military alliances.
From NATO to the Middle East to Asia.
Exactly. And we've seen how these elections have consequences that reach far beyond the U.S. It really shapes the lives and security of people all over the world, doesn't it?
It does. It's a constantly evolving situation, this global landscape. And as we wrap things up, I think it's important to think about, the long-term impacts of these U.S. foreign policy choices.
You're right. We talked about the immediate impacts, but what about those lasting effects? The ones that could shape the world for years, even decades to come.
That's what we need to consider. One major factor is the impact on, global trust and cooperation. The U.S. has always played a big role in building and maintaining those international institutions, those alliances.
But we've seen how changes in U.S. policy can cause problems.
They can create uncertainty, erode the trust that's been built among allies.
So consistency in U.S. engagement, that's really important.
Hugely important. When allies aren't sure about those U.S. commitments, they might start looking for other partners. Or they might take actions that actually destabilize things even more.
It's like a ripple effect.
It is. It can lead to a world that's more fragmented, less cooperative. And that makes it harder to tackle the big challenges we're all facing. Things like climate change, pandemics, economic crises.
We can't solve those problems alone. We need to work together.
Right, exactly. We need that shared sense of purpose. And that's why it's crucial to think beyond just, the immediate political wins. We have to consider those long-term consequences of U.S. foreign policy.
So a more predictable, stable U.S. presence on the world stage, that helps build trust.
It does. It encourages that cooperation we need. And ultimately, it contributes to a more secure future for everyone. More prosperous, too.
I'm really struck by how complex all of this is. It's a lot for policymakers to grapple with, but I also see a lot of potential for positive change.
Me too.
If we have these open discussions, consider different viewpoints, prioritize the long-term solution.
Instead of just those quick wins.
Right, exactly. I think we can create a future where cooperation and shared prosperity really do win out.
I think so, too.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on.
It is.
We've learned so much in this deep dive about the connections between U.S. elections and global military alliances. It's clear those decisions made in Washington have a ripple effect across the world.
They do.
But I think the biggest takeaway for our listener and for all of us is that we have a role to play in shaping that future by staying informed, engaging in these important conversations, and advocating for the kind of world we want to see. So, to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new insights and sparked some important conversations. Until next time, keep exploring these issues, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you.